So we have the pleasure now to hear Paolo Ossola. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. So first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's amazing. I'm a clinical psychiatrist, so being here, like in these 2 days, I've really learned a lot of things. Amazing poster. Congratulations to everyone. It was super informative. So I would try to kind of explain what Valence biases are in affective disorder. And basically, when they invited me, I was like, bit like that. So yeah, that's amazing. They will love my data on depressive disorder. But the truth is that now I feel more or less like this. Because like my perception of the world is only partial, especially back at home, and does not account for everything that can happen around me. So this bias that I had and that I don't have anymore is basically an optimism bias, and this is our tendency to overestimate the probability of like winning at a sport or like excelling in a math exam, or even giving a decent talk. And at the same time, we tend to underestimate like bad information. So for example, if you are to a couple of newlyweds, you ask, what's the likelihood of divorce? They will say likely 0%, but the truth is like it's 50%. And so the same of get fired or having uncomfortable question and in conferences. So I would try to quickly explain like this for 3 tasks. And the first one is the optimism bias in unipolar depression. And I spell out unipolar depression because might be different from bipolar depression, not saying out loud, with negative expectation in unipolar depression and how they learn from feedback, especially related to anhedonia. So this first part, the first task is something I did back few years ago with Tali Sharot and Neil Garrett, that at the time was her PhD student. And so I don't know if you're familiar with the belief update task, but basically you are exposed to events, possible events, 40 of them, like burglary, and you're asked to estimate the probability of getting that event. So I can say, okay, considering where I'm from, everything is 40%. Then we show you the actual probability on average based on your surrounding. And we say, okay, no, it's 30%. And what happened is that after a run, we'll ask you again, like, sorry, can you tell us what's your probable estimate of getting burglary? And what we see is that you give a new estimate, and the difference between the first estimate and the second estimate is called update. As you can see here, this participant kind of overestimated the actual probability because 30% is, yeah, here, 30% is smaller than 40%. So he received a kind of a good news. But even the opposite can happen. So, for example, car fraud, I can estimate 20%, but the real probability is 30%. So in this case, I receive a bad news, and I have to update this bad news. What happened, and is already been tested in a healthy population around the world, everything, is that healthy subjects show this kind of optimism bias, where they tend to update way more good news compared to bad news. And this optimism bias is not really set in stone, but it can change with age, environment, a lot of variables. And so as a psychiatrist, why am I interested in optimism bias? As you know, depression is a constellation of symptoms. I'm referring to the DSM in general, but it's a constellation of symptoms that has sadness, pessimism, and apathy, energy, and so on. So if they are pessimistic for at least 2 weeks, almost every day, maybe the optimism bias can have something to do with that. And just for those of you who are not familiar, depressive episode is a recurrent disorder in which you are depressed on average is like 6 months, and then you get better if treated and go back to the normal state defined euthymia. And for some depression, maybe not all of them, there's a cognitive model, the one from Beck, that kind of help in understanding depression. And these assume that the subject and interact with the environment, so that the subject has a genetic vulnerability. And as we know, depression is hereditary. And some environmental trigger, especially in the first years, might activate some schema that make bias, enhance some biases in the interpretation of emotional stimuli that can be either internal or external stimulus. And these are like, for example, attention, processing, or memory. And the idea of this model is that these kind of biases like generate and maintain depressive symptoms. And in a sort, what's really interesting, in a sort of loop, negative expectation and all these depressive symptoms might maintain the biases in depression, so fostering the disorder. So why we're interested in this model? For sake of time, I kind of skipped the first part, but there's a recent paper by, the group is the Affective Brain Lab led by Tali Sharot, and they show that belief updating, the task I show you, has a genetic component. So they compare monozygotic and dizygotic twins, like an amazing study. And they show that 30% is comparable, inherited in monozygotic but not dizygotic twins. There are environmental triggers that affect these biases. There's a paper by Neil Garrett on that, and I saw a poster here on how COVID changes the optimism bias. But we are more interested for getting quicker to the bias processing, like how I process information in a biased manner. And what they show in the beginning, and they show by Christoph Korn, I think in German, the population was German, but I'm not sure. And then Neil Garrett again in UK, and we try and replicate it in Italy. And also in France, I think Hugo Botman found exactly the same, is that depressed patient, unipolar depressed patient, do not have this kind of bias. And so are more likely to update more bad news. And interestingly, it's kind of what interesting is, like they are more realistic actually, but apart from that, there's a correlation between the bias and the BDI score as a severity. So they kind of hypothesized that there was a kind of causal relation. And why I'm interested, what I'm getting through in this talk is like, okay, here we look in the subject level, but what happened if we focus on the environment specifically? And we got to the second part of the talk, that is like how negative expectation interact in unipolar depression. And this part of work was still done with Neil Garrett, that at the time was a postdoc at Nathaniel Doe, and with Neil Dundon, that helped in the actual building the task. And so we looked at the foraging task that, as Chris mentioned the first day, can be interesting to look for the expectation. So what we did is like, you are way more familiar than me with the optimal foraging theory, but the basic idea is like, should I take a currently available option? So for example, accept a job offer, or maybe forego in the expectation that a better option will come along. So maybe that I got a position as a professor somewhere else. And what's interesting is that deciding which option to engage and which to forego requires developing an accurate belief about the overall distribution of prospect. And this is the idea we started for this task. And the task is quite funny. You drive a spaceship, and there are like enemies around in this galaxy, and you can decide whether to accept to fight the spaceship or release the prey and continue foraging the galaxy. And if you accept the prey, you kind of engage the prey for a definite time that we modulate, that is kind of the capture time and is a delay. And after that given time, you got a reward. And it's like fuel for future foraging and so on. And as you can imagine, the prey are not all the same. You've got I'd like to make the comparison like I'm a lion or like a gender lion, like a lioness in the savannah, and I'm hunting. So I can have really good prey that are like here, low delay and high reward. I shot a bit and I got a lot of fuel. And this is a kind of hunting for easy prey, let's say. Apologies for vegetarian and for those. But on the other way, I can have bad preys that are high delay and low reward, in which I shot a lot and I've got only few points. And these are like hunting for mice in the savannah. And we also have intermediate preys that, as you can imagine, has high delay, high reward, like antelopes, that in which you have to run a lot to get one, or into low delay, low reward, that is like hunting sloth, that are not really tasty, but well. So the point is that we manipulated the galaxies, as you can imagine, because like they can face rich and poor environment. And in rich environment, what happened is like the rainy season, in which you've got a lot of buffalo and a lot of child buffalo, I don't know the name, but them, easy to catch, lots of reward, fat, delicious. And you've got poor environment in which you've got like a dry season full of mice. And what happened is that ideally, what I should do as a lion is like, okay, the intermediate prey, so sloth, antelopes, I shouldn't hunt them in a rich environment because I have the good preys, but in the bad environment is like, okay, maybe sloth are not so bad. Why not? I give it a chance. And what's interesting that we found is that when you move from a rich to a poor environment, you kind of have an optimism bias. You can, in which you say, no, the good prey will come along. I just have to wait a bit more. And so we tried it in these two papers. They demonstrate again the same thing, but we tried it in Italy because maybe that's different. But good news, we've got exactly the same results. They are healthy subjects. They accept the best. They change the intermediate according to the environment. So less intermediate in the rich environment, more intermediate in the poor environment, and they kind of don't really like the worst prey. And now we go to depression. So we tested in 32 depressed subjects, unipolar depressed subject, and they are like, what we found is like they don't have this kind of bias, this optimism bias when passing from the rich from the poor to the rich environment. So they do not adapt and maybe maintain this kind of negative expectation. And at the same time, as you can see, they accept a lot. And we hypothesize that this kind of general tendency to overexploit might be a negative expectation, like it can only get worse. So I have to take everything now because even mice can finish. And interestingly, what we found, it was a positive association between the acceptance rate and the depressive symptoms. And specifically, is like it was super strong for the worst prey. So that the more I'm depressed I am, more I'm likely to accept the worst prey. Even for the intermediate was significant, but the idea is like, okay, I'm accepting everything. So we wonder like, okay, good, but why is that? What's the kind of feedback they want? So we started from the classic reinforcement learning framework. And so if with the idea that if I have a positive expectation and I receive a punishment or a lower reward, I have a negative prediction error. And the idea is that this negative prediction error might affect my mood. You might be familiar with Aaron Elder papers on mood as a representation of the momentum. But what is more interesting is that depressed subjects, if they really have this negative expectation, even if they receive a bad news or a small punishment should be still better than their expectations. So it should improve their mood. But the truth is that they're still depressed. So there are at least two possible explanations. They're not mutually exclusive, and it's super interesting, like, to see all your tasks to test these hypotheses. And it's like maybe because of the apathy, abulia, all the negative symptoms you mentioned, they actually don't engage in action that give them feedback. If I'm in bed all day, it's really unlikely that I get even a negative feedback, but higher than my expectation. So I stay in bed. Or another option is that simply they do not learn from negative feedback, from punishment. And this is a kind of a really debated topic that while we did this project I'm going to show you, we try to understand, but really literature is a super mix on that. And so what we did, the moment of shameless self-promotion, you see that if you've got anergia, a motivation, or anhedonia, so maybe what's your role as a computational neuroscientist is to help us in disentangle not the real disorder, but the symptoms specifically. And what would be great to hear from you is like, how can I dissect transdiagnostic symptoms? We saw previous with Fabien that we have like motivation and anergia in schizophrenia, major depression, and they show that is mechanistically different. So what we did with Alex Pike, that now he's at the University of York, is like try to build these special issues that is out now in Neuroscience Behavioral Review, in which we suggest that we should start from psychopathology like psychiatrists do. So we do not study depression, schizophrenia. We study symptoms. So it would be great that model could explain how is different like anhedonia in depression, opiate use disorder, and so on. And going back to the talk, we then look at the learning from feedback and anhedonia, because it was something I was interested in too, as anhedonia might be different in opiate use disorder, depression, and so on. And again, I asked the help of Neil and Anthony Bishara for the modeling part. And so we saw before, I think Philippe was, he used the switch tasking paradigm. And we did exactly the same with the Wisconsin car sorting test, but instead of looking at the change of rule, we said, okay, can we extract anything else from the paradigm? I don't know if you're familiar, but the idea is like, I've got a trial, I have to match for color, number, or shape. I got a feedback, for example, it's color. I got the feedback that is wrong. So I got the next trial and I say, okay, it's not color, can still be, I don't know, shape or number. And then I choose the number is the correct one. And I have to maintain that for 10 trials. And then it changed unexpectedly. So we test them in a group of anhedonic patients with major depression, schizophrenia, opiate use disorder. And we tested anhedonia as using SHAPS, and we test also depressive symptoms and so on. And what we found is like we decided to apply this model, this learning model, that it's an attentional learning model in which you kind of use the like a vector of choices as to establish a kind of a prediction error in which like at the beginning the vector is like always sum to 1 and it is like 30%, 30%, 30%. And then as long as you receive feedback, you increase the weight of each option of the 3 possible options like color, shape, and number. And what happened is that like we fit different model, and the winning model, long story short, is the one that has a learning rate for positive feedback, negative feedback, and decision consistency. And what we found is that anhedonia was negatively related to learning from negative feedback, from the wrong feedback. So what we did is, and we are hypothesized, is that more anhedonic patients learn less from negative feedback because, because they expect this kind of information. And last slide, perfectly on time. So overall, we suggest that unipolar depressed subjects have this kind of pessimistic bias, that is, according to Beck model, that part. Negative expectation result in a tendency of overexploit the environment, but at the same time, I do not learn from punishment, and these maintain anhedonic symptoms. Like, oh, I do something, I got a feedback like, okay, you should change. I do not change, and I persevere in that kind of behavior. Based on this, we are pursuing 2 new lines of research. One is what's going on bipolar disorder. And on this beautiful paper, we show that the belief update is related to the relapse. As we were saying, we are interested in predicting the course of illness. So we looked at like, okay, how, we took like 40 something bipolar euthymic patient, they were well, and we follow up them for 5 years, and we looked when they relapsed. And the greater the optimism bias, the more likely they were to be well over time. The smaller the optimism bias, the more they were likely to relapse. And unexpectedly, it was both for manic and depressive episode. So that in this paper, we are still recruiting, but euthymic patients have an optimism bias, but both depressed and manic don't. The reason we can discuss might be mixed features, I don't know. So maybe we should, or probably we should focus on effort and so on. And the other thing is like, okay, can this inform us on treatment? So we are starting, hypothetically, this study on neurofeedback. So can I teach patients not to be biased, like showing them which area are activating when learning from punishment and so on? And so with David Mahler, we are trying to put the depressed patient in the fMRI and show that their activation of brain activity, and so then, okay, try to self-regulate that area that is specifically linked with the negative expectation. And then that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah,
No.
brilliant talk. No, I mean, I was just wondering if I'm correct in the task, the over exploitation of the environment, the cost was delay, right?
Yes, yes.
Do you think it will be the same with different kind of cost?
Like
effort,
what?
for example?
No. Any suggestion?
I cannot imagine anything.
No. I don't know. We discussed that, especially because there's no punishment in that sense. So we kind of abstracted a bit. Yeah. I don't know. The truth is that we are also testing, and we almost finished the recruitment, subject with substance use disorder, to see if like depression is not really related to the delay, but delays more specifically, because of course, health control are not medicated, depressed patients are medicated. So maybe gambling disorder are similarly medicated. So we want to compare that on is specific for the delay, or we should look something else. I don't know, you suggest.
And second question, about the last result, which seems wonderful actually, about the fact that you predict the relapse in bipolarity. I was just wondering to what extent the mechanisms that be, if you're more optimistic, you take your treatment because you think that it will work compared to if you're pessimistic.
Absolutely. We control for a lot of things. It's been published in the reviewer. Where are you, the reviewer? Okay, good. Really annoyingly. To ask, just to know. I know where you work, but the reviewer asked a lot about controlling for medication. So we also had lithium level and so on, and where they were kind of stabilized patient euthymic. And also in the previous paper, but you can find also in the published version, like we'll also look at the reaction times as well, because like I'm a bit dumb as a psychiatrist, so I really was like, yeah, but what is punishment sensitivity? So we show that is related to the reaction times and how you process the feedback and so on. But
Hi, thank you for the really interesting talk. I have a kind of clarification and question to better understand these kind of 2 points in the field. So there's on one hand, the fact that people with depression don't show the same optimism bias, and some people even show, or it could be considered a negative bias in what they expect or remember, a greater saliency of negative events. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there's also the fact that they learn, they expect negative events in the first place, and so that would decrease their learning, their prediction error, and decrease their learning rate, as you showed at the end. And so how can we conciliate those two aspects?
That's a really good point, and we discussed that. And the idea is like, this optimism bias is not really a learning thing, because you're not like actually receiving feedback on what you're doing. It's like, you can, even if you look at the estimation error, but it's more how you process information. It's not like a feedback in that sense. You don't win or lose. It's more like the way they process information. But yeah, that's definitely a good point.
It's a joke question, but do you run yourself the experiments?
Yeah.
Because maybe you induce the optimism bias.
That's actually the theory behind
some normal psychiatry.
But no, the German one and the English one, that's not me.
I mean, not you want, the boring one, the boring one. Classic, you know.
Yeah, I think so I was just wondering how you feel about causality of the result, because I can imagine that either is the case that people who are depressed get more pessimistic view of the world and they tend to overexplore negative options. And it could also be that because they tend to overexplore these negative options, that in the end they become depressed because they're constantly contemplating. So
I have no idea. That's the truth is that you can dissect only that if you got a cohort and you test repeatedly and you see when they develop what comes first. Overall, I think there might be like that the biases come first, because like all the study by Kath Harmer, they show that the bias, it's like before the subjective response. So for example, if I treat a patient, they have this bias. It was a paper on American Journal like 2003. They have this biased, like the lack of bias like that, and when they take medication, just even in the early phase, and I think that Hugo exactly showed the same, even in the early phase when they are not well yet, the bias become normal, like optimistically biased. So probably the bias comes before the symptoms, but yeah, to test that you need repeated measures. I just I'm trying to remember, like in which study, because this one in the depressed study, usually depressed patients are slightly older. Bipolar patients similarly were in their 40, but what Tally showed with Sarah Blakemore is like that you've got a U-shaped a belief updating, so that younger subject and older subject are way more optimistic. And when you are in your 40 giving talk, you are really, really realistic. But yeah, generally it follows a U-shaped curve. And I think that now Kath Harmer is working specifically on adolescent and first episode depression. No gender effects in general. That's the review on Trend in Cognitive Science by Neil and Tally, and they kind of cover the whole thing, if you're interested.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was just wondering whether you had any insight in the no optimism bias in manic patients, the thing you showed at the end.
I was super disappointed, because like I started that project, it's really long ago, and as a trainee in psychiatry, and I went to Tally and saying, oh, we should do that, and I was expecting like manic patient to be super optimistic, but the truth is that manic patients are not necessarily happy. Like it's still manic episode, even if you are lots of drive and everything, it's a discomfort, like you don't sleep, you can't sleep well, and everything, like it's kind of a slippery slope in that sense. So we interpret that, but we're still refining that results. But the idea is like, okay, probably the belief updating reflects more cognitive state.
So did it include mixed states sort of patient?
I tried not to, but the truth is that even if you look for, we avoided mixed patient, the old version of mixed patient, but the truth is that when they feel the BDI, you still have super high score even for manic patient because they're on different domains. So, but there's no association with symptoms specifically.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Paolo.